We all know that human activities are changing the atmosphere in unexpected and in unprecedented ways.
If you're like me, you've been hearing about the climate crisis for a long time. Whenever you do, it's always that things are bad, or things are still bad, or things are worse. Why aren't things getting better? The question isn't whether or not climate change is a problem, it's why climate change is still a problem. The scientific community reached a consensus about the threat of climate change in the 1980s, and the public has been presented with the facts of the crisis for decades. There have been countless innovations to help us drive cleaner cars, eat cleaner foods, and produce cleaner energy for everything else. But in 2023, global greenhouse gas emissions were still climbing to record highs, making international targets to cut emissions in half by 2030 and achieve net zero emissions by 2050 feel more and more unattainable. Why? It's because the climate crisis isn't a technical issue, it's a political one. Global renewable energy consumption may be reaching record highs, but so are global meat consumption and fossil fuel demand. More clean doesn't mean less dirty. But what if we could just capture all of the emissions we're creating to achieve net zero emissions? You may have heard of carbon capture, a term describing a set of technologies that in some cases filter out CO2 from industrial emissions, and in other cases extract pre-existing CO2 directly from the atmosphere. Carbon capture has been all the rage in the climate conversation, but unfortunately it's not the answer to all of our problems. If you're curious why, I've made a separate video explaining its shortcomings. Like I said, the climate crisis isn't a technical issue, it's a political one. Experts agree that the only way we can clean up the mess is to stop producing so much mess. That means transitioning from dirty to clean energy, using less energy in general, and farming less meat. But those things are deeply entrenched in our culture and lifestyles. Cutting back on them requires massive, widespread sacrifice. For consumers, it means scaling back luxuries and comforts we've come to know, as it will take time to produce the standard of living that we currently enjoy thanks to dirty energy from clean energy. For industry, it means scaling back profit and growth expectations that have been built over decades, as it will take time for investments in cleaner means of production to pay off. It's upsetting to think that the way we've lived life, the world we've come to know, needs to change, especially in the face of a threat that is so hard to visualize and internalize, like the climate crisis. It makes sense that we'd be inclined to accept any testimony that casts doubt on that. If the guidance urging change isn't overwhelmingly definitive, there's a contagious tendency to not take the guidance seriously, especially if it's not mandatory. If everyone around you is making a sacrifice, then you probably would too, if only to avoid being shamed by your community. But if only a few of your peers were doing so, and if they were also fairly abrasive in their attempts to recruit you to join them, then you likely wouldn't be too compelled to change. The problem at hand is convincing enough people to make a short-term sacrifice for a long-term gain. Solving such a problem requires an institution that is incentivized to maximize long-term societal welfare, is immune to the conflicting incentives of profit-seeking, and is powerful enough to enforce accountability for both industry and consumers. The only such institution is the government. When faced with similar problems that required collective sacrifice, we've seen government rise to the occasion. In World War II, the whole country rallied around the call to avenge Pearl Harbor and combat Nazi expansion, totally changing their lifestyles in order to support the war effort. Americans accepted that certain resources needed to be rationed. Families drove less to preserve gasoline, changed their diets to eat less meat, and even gave up their morning coffee for a shared purpose. But the sacrifice wasn't initiated by individual selflessness. It was the product of government mandates. We've seen this even more recently with the ozone crisis. In the 1970s, scientists discovered that some types of chemicals that were used to make hairspray, refrigerators, and air conditioners were eroding ozone in the stratosphere, which protects us from sun radiation. world governments responded by ratifying the Montreal Protocol, which banned any production that used such chemicals. Now the ozone layer is on track to be fully replenished by 2050. The key distinction between these two examples and the climate crisis is that, in this case, the short-term interests of industry conflict with those of the rest of society. During World War II, although the public reduced their consumption of many goods, including oil, the companies that produced those goods didn't lose business. In fact, many saw increased business. They just sold to the government instead of to individual consumers. In the case of the ozone crisis, the companies that relied on the chemicals that were eroding the ozone figured out how to produce the same products without using those chemicals, and realized that they could be even more profitable if they made the transition, so they did. In the case of the climate crisis, the fossil fuel industry has yet to make a sufficient effort to figure out how to evolve its business, despite some reports that they've been trying their best. Instead, the industry has spent decades financing extensive and effective disinformation campaigns to create doubt in the public discourse around the urgency of the crisis, and has spent billions of dollars lobbying politicians and international organizations to not enforce stricter regulations on fossil fuels. BP Oil even innovated the carbon footprint campaign to divert responsibility away from the fossil fuel industry and onto the average consumer. The International Energy Agency projects that the industry will need to increase the percentage of their total spending dedicated to clean energy investments from 2.5% recorded in 2022 all the way up to 50% by 2030. So how do we get the fossil fuel industry on board? At the end of the day, moral appeals to the executives of fossil fuel companies are not likely to be very successful. They aren't undermining the crisis because they're evil and want to watch the world burn. They're operating according to the incentives of our economic system, which prioritize short-term interests and make it unappealing to pursue initiatives that benefit society at the expense of their shareholders. In order to get fossil fuels on the same page, we need to change those incentives. And the only entity capable of doing so is the government. Getting where we need to depends on governments imposing stricter regulations on fossil fuels and enacting policies that work to change economic incentives for both consumers and corporations to embrace clean energy transitions. As long as the incentives stay the same, the industry can't be expected to effectively regulate itself. It needs an impartial regulator. So why hasn't government risen to the occasion of the climate crisis? Unfortunately, the fossil fuel industry has substantial influence over the world governments charged with keeping it accountable, so the regulator isn't exactly impartial. Until that changes, it's unlikely that anything else will. But that's a subject for another video. Some of you might ask, is all this fuss even worth it? If we've been dragging our feet for decades, are we not too late at this point? The best analogy I've heard regarding the climate crisis is comparing it to a train speeding towards a huge cement wall. At this point, there's no stopping the train from hitting the wall, but the speed at which it hits the wall means everything. If we hit it at 150 miles per hour versus 200 miles per hour, countless lives might be saved. Similarly, if we can slow global warming to 2 degrees Celsius, as opposed to 2.5 degrees, we might be able to prevent the inevitable devastation we're facing from reaching even more dramatic levels. Any progress we make is worth it, and we need to make as much of it as we can, as fast as we can.